Brian, you might not say this, but I will say this for you. You have played a pivotal role in really mobilizing the youth movement for climate action here in Arizona. Talk a little bit about, sort of paint a picture of your journey, your experience so far, and especially as a first-generation Mexican-American.
Yeah, so as a first-generation Mexican-American, my parents and my grandparents came here to this country, and they built a life for themselves off of hard work and hard labor, especially. Very low-wage jobs, very long hours, long days, weeks, and years until they reach where they are now. And now I have the privilege of being able to be here, standing and sitting here with you, talking with you about being a youth climate activist rather than having to worry about working multiple jobs to help provide for the family. And a lot of people, especially other young working class people of color in the Latinx community, don't have that privilege. So for those of us with that privilege, like myself and everyone here, we need to really be thinking about how it's our responsibility to uplift the voices that aren't heard, and especially ensure that we're empowering them and advocating for the basic human rights that a lot of people in this country and across the world are denied every day. So when it comes to being a first-generation Mexican-American in the climate justice movement, one that is entirely led by youth, it's really important to acknowledge that a lot of times in this movement, I'm sure you see what happens with Greta Thunberg, and recently in the Associated Press, what happened with the Ugandan climate activist Vanessa Nakate, who was cropped out of that picture of 3 white climate activists, simply, I guess, for the convenience of not having a person of color there. So as a Mexican-American and a person of color in this movement, it's really easy to get drowned out among other lighter, whiter voices. So it's really important that we really reach out to these communities, ensure that we're not speaking for them and not letting others who haven't had those experiences speak for them, but uplifting their voices instead.
That's amazing. Yes. I want to come back to that theme in just a minute, but before we do, kind of help us understand a little bit about the Arizona Youth Climate Strike, the work that you're doing here locally across the state. What has that journey been like so far? What are the issues that you're working to advance, to address? What have been some of your greatest successes so far?
Yeah, so the Arizona Youth Climate Strike is a statewide network of middle school, high school, and college students in Arizona advocating for bold legislative action to address the climate crisis. So around this time last year, we started as a group of 5 students from Phoenix, high school students, myself included, I was a senior, to where we are now around a year later. We have over 100 student volunteers involved with us. We have student organizing teams in over 13 cities and towns in Arizona. And it's taken a year to get here, but it's been really exciting. Our first event last year, March 19th of 2019, we had a climate strike at the state capitol here in Phoenix, and we had a few hundred people come out, roughly 100 people come out, September 20th, after we spent a few months building the foundation, advocating on climate issues and informing people of what was kind of going on, not just in Arizona with the climate crisis, but around the world. We saw on September 20th, we joined strikes across the nation led by youth. And we had a few thousand people turn up around Arizona in the big three cities, Phoenix, Tucson, Flagstaff, and along with other handful of cities. And in between these strikes, we've been working on another project called the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge, which essentially we meet with local elected officials and candidates and politicians and ask them to reject campaign contributions from the fossil fuel and utility industries that have played a disproportionate role in the destruction and the demise of our ability to have a safe, livable future.
That's awesome. And so when you and your peers think about what a safe future looks and feels like here in Phoenix and Arizona, what are some of the main issues that you're facing?
Yes, so in Arizona specifically, as I'm sure many of you could tell if you're not from here, it's a little dry. We are in a desert, and we have been in a drought for quite a while, although in a lot of places where we have access to running water and stuff like that, it's a little harder to notice that. So in Arizona, we're seeing a lot of disproportionate effects, especially in our communities of color and our low-income communities, where we see that, for an example, here in the Valley in South Phoenix, we see that we have a lot of working-class families that, have kids that are struggling with asthma, because in South Phoenix, where most of the Latino communities are in Phoenix, we see that there is a higher amount of air pollution, much higher than anywhere else in the Valley, and especially much higher than anywhere here in Scottsdale. And this is directly correlated to, the populations of those areas. And these people are often struggling to, treat their kids and afford these inhalers that are extremely expensive, while they're also struggling to afford, just being able to stay alive and surviving with a lot of jobs that pay, starvation wages. So a lot of times we see that these communities of color are going to be the first to be affected by the climate crisis. And when we talk about the climate crisis like it's some far-off issue and something we're still preparing for, there are already communities that are being affected by it.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit, I know, I want to clap every other sentence. We talked a little bit briefly when we chatted about sort of just resilience and community resilience, and I know that's been a central part of your work too. Can you talk about how that's sort of taking shape from the grassroots up here through the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so a lot of times when it comes to climate action, people think about, the national level, the private sector, doing this and that investments here and there, cap and trade, I don't know all the big terms. But, we also think about a lot of federal action from Congress and places like that. At least from our group, we've been taking more of a grassroots approach, going city by city, and all the teams we have in cities across Arizona, specifically in Tempe, we've been advocating for climate action plans. Essentially, kind of scoping out plans for cities to take legislative and policy-based action based in the science to ensure that they're protecting and planning for resilience for the communities that are already being affected by the climate crisis, and ensuring that they're, planning out how they're going to mitigate the effects of the climate crisis by reducing their own carbon footprints and CO2 emissions. So, in Tempe, we advocated for stronger climate justice and, environmental equity standards on their climate action plan with, resilience hubs that would be powered by, solar energy and things like that, renewable energies that wouldn't be necessarily affected by the same issues as the rest of the power grid, to ensure that no matter what might happen in a natural disaster, that there's always areas where the most vulnerable members of the community are able to go and seek shelter. And we did see that the Tempe Climate Action Plan passed unanimously at the Tempe City Council.
That's huge. That's huge. So this is sort of a question I've been grappling with. I'm curious your take on it, maybe others too. It's clear hearing you speak, it seems like across the youth climate movement that the emphasis is so, environmental sustainability is obviously key, and the social equity piece is front and center. I have not heard a young person talk about action on the climate crisis without talking about environmental equity, without talking about putting people at the center of that. It seems like young people get this, just inherently get it, in a way that many of their adult counterparts are still working to kind of grapple with and internalize in a way. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, so oftentimes I think that when we're thinking about, the whole environmental movement, a lot of young people understand the issue because we don't have a choice other than to understand it. We see, we're often sat down and told our whole lives growing up that, especially when we try to enter spaces like these, that, we're too young to know what we're talking about. We're too young to have our own thoughts. So we're too young to basically be of any use to any, discussion other than, what we're doing at school or something like that. So when we talk about the intersectionality of the climate crisis and the issues around it, we need to acknowledge that it's really integral that, climate justice issues are also racial justice issues, socioeconomic justice issues, healthcare justice issues, women's issues, gender issues, racial issues, and, these are all inextricably linked, and you can't fight for one of these issues without fighting for all of them.
Yeah, hear, hear. Let's get a cheers for that. So I'm gonna come over to you, Heather, at Sidebar in just a minute, but before we do, I want to kind of build on that and bring it back here to GreenBiz. You're sitting in a room of corporate executives, leaders from many of the most impactful NGOs. What's your ask of this community? How can we and how can adults in general support you and your peers in the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So what I really need from all of you is I really need all of you to feel the urgency of what my generation is feeling. We see this almost every day. A lot of us deal with a lot of, anxiety and depression related to eco-grief, and, the fact that, while we're sitting here and we're having these conversations, simultaneously there are still ecosystems collapsing, species going extinct, and other human beings across the world, being displaced and affected by the climate crisis, losing their homes and losing their lives and everything they know, and yet nothing is still being done to solve this issue. So I need you to feel that urgency, and I need you to really feel what we feel every single day. And that is that, we need these solutions, and we don't have time to be waiting for these long discussions to happen. We needed these long discussions years ago, decades ago, when we knew about what the climate crisis was, and we didn't have them. So right now, when people tell us we need to take things slow, right now when people tell us we're being too aggressive, that we're being too forward moving, that we're not, we need to learn to take things slower. I think they needed to learn to take things faster years ago when they found out about these issues, because right now we don't have any time to waste with the political niceties and not being honest with our thoughts. A lot of adults tell us we come off the wrong way, that we should take a moment to consider being a little more calm when we're having these conversations. I think we need to be angrier. I think we need to be hearing more of the outcry from our generation and from adults too, because it's so important that in a lot of the spaces we still can't enter, you can, and you can be doing so much more. And I know at this conference, so many corporations and businesses are being represented, and a lot of people here representing those employers should feel ashamed about what your companies have been doing or have not been doing over the past few years. There are so many things I could be listing that I don't have time to do in one sitting. There are so many things and wrongdoings I could be listing from so many different companies and corporations that I don't have time to do in one sitting. But you do, and you have months and days and years after this day, after this discussion, to be holding your own employers accountable, to be holding your coworkers accountable, to be advocating for these issues as much as we do. Because at the same time, I have a chemistry quiz as soon as I get back from this conference. I have a lot of stuff to do, but this is your job, and you have all day, literally all day to be doing this. So that's what I need you to be doing.
All right, let's hear what you all are thinking, Ms. Clancy.
Yeah, it is. I don't know if I'm on. Hello? Yes, now you can hear me. There you go. Sorry. The chatter is building on that question. What specific actions, right? So you just might mention policy. And so what specific things can they do locally, like not in Arizona, if they're in other places in the country? Give them some advice, or give them some action plans.
Yeah, so like I was saying, the climate crisis isn't just an environmental issue. There's an equity aspect, there's an economic aspect, a racial, gender aspect. So something that we really need to be seeing, and a lot of times when we see these communities that are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, these are, as I keep saying, the working class communities of people of color. Our Latinx communities, our indigenous communities, our African American communities. And a lot of these people sometimes don't have the same access to education opportunities to have these high paying jobs that a lot of people here in Scottsdale, Arizona might have. So when we're talking about climate action and what you can do right now, a lot of times it can start as something as simple as paying your workers a livable wage, not starvation wages, paying them something that they can actually make a quality of life for themselves out of, providing them with benefits that will ensure that they have the opportunities and tools to help prepare and be more resilient to the effects of the climate crisis as they come towards their communities. A lot of times it can be as simple as that. So aside from that, a lot of times it applies to different businesses, not necessarily the NGOs, but especially the big corporations or anything working in the finance realm, I guess, is divesting from these fossil fuel and utility industries, divesting from natural gas, from coal, and from these industries that have been relentlessly, I guess, destroying the capability of my generation to have a future, and still refuse to clean it up despite the disproportionate impact in creating this crisis.
Do you have, all right, great. We're gonna bring it home. I'm gonna go with a different question, something that just came up for me this morning. I think, I've certainly been hearing a lot from the GreenBiz community about how inspired we are. I know for me personally, every time I look at a news story or recently saw a trailer for a new movie coming out that's a documentary that's been tracking the youth climate movement and action on the Green New Deal, I was bawling at the end. I feel so inspired and so enlivened by you. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the people in this room are feeling inspired. What inspires you? Like when you sit with grappling about our future and the fear and the uncertainty, where do you source your inspiration?
Yeah, so to start, based on the situation my generation has inherited, I'm sure you can tell I don't source this inspiration very often from adults. When I was talking about how far our organization, the Arizona Youth Climate Strike, has grown from 5 high school students in Phoenix to this whole statewide network of dozens and hundreds of student advocates from cities across Arizona, that is what gives me inspiration. It's seeing all these students that were younger than I was when I first joined the movement, that are more well-spoken than I was when I first joined the movement, joining and standing alongside the rest of their fellow students from Arizona and advocating for solutions is what really inspires me. At the same time as well, a lot of adults have stepped up to help us, and a lot of adults have stepped up to help us advocate for these solutions and for climate justice-centered solutions. And a lot of times these are politicians, while regardless of how much I may not trust a lot of politicians, there are a handful that I really see inspire me, and these are a lot of our Arizona local politicians. And so even if you're not from Arizona, if you are from Arizona, I recommend just finding these really grassroots-powered elected officials and politicians that are working against the status quo to provide these solutions for my generation. Here in Arizona, we're seeing so many new, not corporate-funded politicians, but grassroots donations, individual people powering their campaigns. Here in Arizona, that looks like Anita Malik, who's running for Congress in this district. That looks like Casey Klaus, who's running for Tempe City Council on a climate platform. That looks like Yasmin Ansari, who's running for Phoenix City Council on a climate platform too. A lot of these people give me so much inspiration because while I'm young and I have a few years until I may even consider thinking about potentially running for office, these people are already sitting there and doing it. They're talking the talk and walking the walk. And that's inspiring to me, and that's what I need every adult to be doing.
I don't even live in this state, but I will figure out a way to vote for you if you decide to run for office. I feel like we've covered some of this, but as we come to a close in this conversation, just, you've made a number of really powerful calls to action. If there's one thing that you want people to leave with, if there's any other calls to action, any specific ways in which as we leave and head out to lunch and begin to disperse, an invitation to people to channel their inspiration, connect with you around specific things, one last sort of parting word before we wrap up our conversation.
So we're clear before we end this. I know who I am. I'm a first-generation Mexican-American. I'm a first-generation college student. I'm the product of my parents' labor. Soy un zapoteco del Villa Hidalgo y el Ala in Oaxaca, Mexico, and I'm a youth climate activist. And this year, I really need all of you to know who you are too. I need all of you to be acting and translating empty smiles and words that you might want to give me into actual action. Action, not words. Advocacy, not silence. Bravery, not fear. And for some of you, remorse, not ignorance. I need all of you to feel the urgency that my generation is feeling. And I need you to know who you are and decide when history looks back on this moment, if you're going to be able to see, if your grandchildren, if your children are going to be able to see that you were one of the people that stood up for my generation and for our future, or if you're one of the people that sat there and watched us die. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Brian Mecinas.